Fresh clashes have broken out across Syria, with at least 11 government troops and 10 civilians reported killed. The violence rages on as the Arab League gathers to discuss the progress of its observer mission to the country. Critics say the League's failing to oversee a peace plan under which the Syrian regime agreed to end its crackdown on protesters. More than 100 civilians have allegedly been killed by government troops since the first observers arrived last month. On Friday, dozens died in a suicide bombing in the capital Damascus, which the regime is blaming on terrorists. Let's now get some insight and perspective on the Syrian crisis from Sarah Marasek. She's political analyst at Syracuse University in Beirut. Well, the regime's crackdown on the opposition has apparently continued despite the Arab League's observer mission there, which, as I mentioned a little earlier, critics have described as futile. Isn't it now time to ask the UN to intervene?
Well, it seems a bit suspicious to claim that the Arab League's mission is a failure or is futile before actually listening to the Arab League give its report, before giving the Arab League time that it needs to finish and make its observations. So right now it seems a little bit political to suggest that the Arab League's solution is not working without yet waiting to see what happens. Dialogue is emerging. Right now people are in Cairo meeting to discuss this, and unless they have time to discuss it, they won't know whether or not it's working.
But don't the facts speak for themselves, Sarah? Sorry to interrupt, but surely the government promised to withdraw troops from the streets and stop using force against the civilians. That was their promise, and that was why the monitors were there, to oversee that this was implied and implemented. And it hasn't happened, has it, by what we're seeing in the statistics and the latest deaths?
Of course, what is going on in Syria is absolutely horrendous, and the violence must stop. But we also must consider the fact that the violence is two-sided, that there are attacks against government troops, there are attacks. There was a recent suicide blast that killed dozens of people in Damascus. And so these realities on the ground need to be reflected by the observers, the Arab League observers. And unless they have time to really see both sides of the story, we're not going to know how best to solve this conflict. We're not going to know how best dialogue will happen and who to trust and who to involve in this process. So really, you are right. What is going on in Syria the violence must stop. Yet we need to figure out a way that involves all Syrians in this process, and not just those Syrians who have the ears of Western leaders pushing the Arab League leaders to press forward on a decision that's not in Syria's best interests.
Do you really think they will get an accurate picture of both sides of the story, bearing in mind the Arab League only had about, 150 observers there in Syria? Is that really enough to cover the whole country? I mean, shouldn't other independent monitors be allowed to see what's really going on? And also bearing in mind that foreign media are limited with their access to find out what's going on there.
Yes, of course, this is a good point. But Syria also has to be careful to have reliable people come in and not those with political agendas seeking to destabilize or undermine the Syrian regime. So, of course, there should be more people allowed in. But choosing which people to allow in is a really difficult question. And so right now it looks like the Arab League is going to press for more observers to be let in. And as long as they do so in a clear process that is fair and that the Syrians can agree to, this is a good solution, and it will be one step closer to ending this crisis. Syria has released some prisoners, and they've had attempted to create some sort of dialogue with the opposition. So they're not just standing there laughing at the Arab observers as people are getting killed on the streets. They're actively involved in trying to end this conflict. But you are right. Of course, there is also violence continuing, and this must stop. So the Arab League needs to find a just way to end this crisis and not listen to the Western pressure that's coming from Europe and from America to intervene in Syria and to get the United Nations involved. Right now, let the Arab League try to do its job.
You mentioned that we shouldn't be too quick to assess the success of the monitors there and should wait for the outcome of their conclusions. But whatever they do say, will they have any clout whatsoever on Assad's regime? Do you think it'll have any impact on what they eventually say, what they saw there going on in Syria?
Well, there's been some interesting news this week about, for example, the role of Hamas in helping initiate this observer mission and the negotiations between the Arab League and the Syrian government. And so I think that there are key players that could put pressure on Assad, and he has allies in the region as well that may find it interesting to pursue this diplomatic method, like Turkey and Iran. We don't quite know yet what pressures they can put on Syria, but of course it's going to be difficult to push through. The Syrian government is very isolated, not only internally but regionally and internationally, but it is fair only to have a process that the Syrian people can best negotiate with their government, negotiate with each other, with the different parties, both inside Syria and outside Syria, because there are many voices inside Syria that were not being listened to. Only the Arab League is listening to them right now, and so we have to give that time for that process to really unfold in a just way.
You talk about negotiations but with the opposition, but isn't there a problem here that the opposition is fragmented? There are, as you mentioned a little earlier, there are many different voices there in the opposition, and it's not as cohesive as perhaps we saw there in Libya.
Oh, yes, of course. And this is very important because a lot of the international community, as well as the Arab League, had up until now only heard a very particular voice from the opposition. And those were Syrians outside of Syria who are perhaps the most radical, and many of whom are engaged in a military struggle against and terrorist acts against the Syrian government. So it's very good that they're now being allowed into Syria to talk with other opposition leaders. But yes, of course, this is going to be yet another difficult part of the situation, to figure out how to incorporate as many Syrian voices as possible. But that is democracy. And if this is what the Syrian people want, it's going to be a very difficult process, like it is turning out to be in Egypt, for example, and like it will be in Libya. Libya right now is a lot less united than it was during the war. And so you will see a lot of conflicts emerge in all of these countries as the democratic process unfolds.
Sarah, really good to talk to you. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Good to hear from you there, joining us there in Beirut. Sarah Marisek from the Syracuse University, thank you.